Everybody. Hi, everybody. My name is Johannah Moynihan. I'm an education and psychology double major. I've had the privilege of working with Dr. Catherine Stavropoulos in the School of Education. And today I'm here to present my honors capstone, Parenting Children with Autism Spectrum Disorder in the COVID-19 Pandemic, a cross-cultural comparison. First off, I'd like to do a little note. This review employs several terms interchangeably, such as children affected by ASD, youth with ASD, and autistic children, to encapsulate both the person first and identity first models of disability. I do this purposefully to capture that autism is only one part of these children's identities, and also to validate the identity of autistic scholars and community members that moves away from seeing autism as a deficit. In this way, I hope to advocate for the agency and celebration of the autistic identity while taking into consideration the psychological consequences of severe ASD symptoms on family dynamics. So today, I'll take you through a brief introduction, methods, my findings, discuss some limitations and future directions, and finish up with a conclusion. All right, first off, what is autism? According to the American Psychiatric Association's most recent text revision of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, autism spectrum disorder is characterized by impaired social communication and restricted repetitive behaviors. Impaired social communication and interactions translates to difficulty understanding and responding appropriately to others' emotions, responding to nonverbal cues such as body language, and forming, maintaining, or understanding relationships. Restricted repetitive behaviors may look like repetitively lining up toys, saying the same things over and over again, difficulty with change and routine disruption, hyperfixated interests, or being under or overstimulated by sensory information, such as light and noise. We see that even before the pandemic, parents of autistic children report higher baseline levels of distress, which I delineate as stress, depression, and anxiety, than parents of typically developing children. This may be in part due to more perceived caregiving burdens, difficulty coping with potential aggression from the child, or difficulties communicating with their child. We also know that parental distress negatively impacts child well-being, especially when a positive feedback loop begins, where the child exhibits a disruptive behavior, which stresses out the parent. Parent gets more stressed and worse equipped to respond to the child's needs, which worsens the child's behavioral difficulties. Therefore, parents of children with ASD may be at risk of accumulative stress, where all of their day-to-day stressors build up to reach a breaking point. Furthermore, we know that culture plays a role in how individuals with autism and their families are perceived, and in turn, how much and what kind of support they seek out. There's been countless initiatives to increase autism visibility, awareness, and acceptance. And an estimated 1 in 44 individuals are diagnosed with ASD in the US, a statistic replicable in many other societies across the globe. However, there are still lingering myths and misconceptions surrounding autism, such as cold parenting or vaccines causing autism. These myths and the potentially disruptive behaviors accompanying ASD, such as repetitive noises or movements, contribute to an ASD diagnosis as a source of societal shame for some families. Accordingly, cultural context dictates the level of stigma around autism, as well as the ability and willingness of families to access support services, such as behavioral therapies for the child and mental health support for parents. So now, on top of parents being already stressed and potentially in an unsupportive cultural context, there emerges new challenges presented by the COVID-19 pandemic. The lockdown orders, mandated masking, and overall chaos of the pandemic introduced yet another stressor with new environments of uncertainty, fear, and anxiety. As may be expected, this accumulation of stressors may have implications for parental distress, as they must adapt to and try to explain to their child about the new isolation procedures and routine disruptions. Now, children may not have access to their same foods or their daily routines, and may have to deal with hyperreactivity to the sensory stimuli of masking and washing hands frequently. All these factors in turn contribute to an increase in caregiving responsibilities and a need for rapid adaptation to new public health rules to keep their children safe. Given the combination of the forces of culture, accumulative parental stress, and the new challenges of the pandemic, I decided to embark on this project to examine how parents in different countries responded to and navigated the pandemic. There's been a historical overrepresentation of Western perspectives in ASD, as well as a generally limited geographic range in many reviews. So I looked for trends from studies published during the COVID-19 pandemic to probe for any protective factors, potential governmental or organizational infrastructure or supports, and any potential factors to consider moving forward as we look for ways to best support parents. I conducted a systematic review on parental distress for parents of children with autism by searching in EBSCOhost, Academic Search Complete, and APA PsycInfo for peer-reviewed studies published in English between 2019 and 2023. I used the keywords autism, ASD, or autism spectrum disorder, parent stress or distress, caregiver stress or distress, and COVID-19, coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, or 2019 pandemic to guide my initial search. Next, I chose which studies to incorporate into my review by focusing on only parents of children with ASD, not other neurodevelopmental disabilities or with any explicitly stated co-occurring conditions such as ADHD. From there, I selected 14 studies spanning geographically diverse study locations. I purposefully oversampled studies from non-Western populations in order to avoid having a Western dominant lens and to include a wide variety of study locations not typically included in systematic reviews. After reviewing these 14 studies, I determined the main themes elicited from each study based on their respective findings. Then I compiled pertinent descriptive information, which I'll present in a table detailing study location, child age range, the number of parent participants, how each study measured parental distress or well-being, their respective methodologies, and my takeaways of potential themes. Let's start with studies in the Middle East. So in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Israel, we see exacerbation of already high parental distress, such that parents now have to deal with the new stresses of complying with governmental restrictions, worrying about their child's safety, and adapting their child's routines while still having to deal with the obligations of caregiving. In Qatar and Israel, we see parents forced to adopt multiple roles such as teacher, behavioral interventionist, and more to meet all of their child's needs, given the disruption to in-person services. Surprisingly, we also see decreases in parental distress, perhaps due to sameness in the home environment or better ability to maintain routines for both caregiver and child. Here are 4 highlighted studies from Asia. So we see a lot of the same themes. The role of a supportive cultural context observed in Turkey, cultural stigma focused on fixing autism in China, and parents struggling with their mental health in light of inadequate parental mental health support in India. In Europe, we see parents asking for many of the same things, namely more support for parents who feel like they're struggling, being forced to do it all for their child, and who encounter feelings of hopelessness or despair at not having the expertise to meet their child's needs, or watching their child's academic or behavioral progress from targeted in-person services slip away. In the US and Canada, respectively, national autism infrastructure were able to support parents' mental health needs and buffer some of the distress parents encountered. But even in these cultural contexts where autism is talked about very openly, many parents described low utilization of adaptive coping strategies to deal with their additive stressors. Finally, Adams and colleagues presented insight into the experience of South African caregivers, revealing the protective factor of a supportive cultural context on the ability of caregivers to navigate the pandemic, demonstrating the ability of informal, community, and intergenerational supports to potentially compensate for a lack of national infrastructure. Oops. There we go. So after reviewing these 14 studies, I obtained 6 major themes. Firstly, all of the studies reviewed endorsed an exacerbation of already high distress, as would be expected with the additional stressors of caregiving and increased pressures to keep their children safe. I also noticed the trend of parents adopting multiple roles, often taking on not only the obligations of being a parent, but also those of a speech therapist, behavioral therapist, and more. There were also some relief from the accumulation of stressors for parents who were supported by resource infrastructure and who knew who to reach out to when shifting services online, finding mental health support for themselves, and overall who they could turn to for reputable protocol-aligned advice. Furthermore, parents who engaged in adaptive coping strategies, such as breaking down a problem into actionable goals, and who sought social support from their friends or greater communities, were able to manage their distress. Culture also played a role, such that parents in contexts where ASD is viewed as shameful displayed significant parental distress, and parents often better manage their stress in cultures without as much stigma. Surprisingly, some parents in the highlighted studies reported that their depression, anxiety, and stress actually decreased during the pandemic, which may be attributed to more family time, more indoor routines and sameness for their child, and the ability to control more sensory stimuli within one's own home. Many studies were excluded from this review since they focused on children with disabilities beyond or co-occurring with ASD, which in real life is common and contributes to a complex interplay between ASD and other potential mental or physical health concerns. Additionally, another main limitation is the exclusion of scholarship from specific geographic regions, most notably Latin America, not because there wasn't any scholarship available, but due to the limits of my inclusion criteria and my search for English instead of Spanish and other language literature. Finally, most of the data collected in these studies was obtained online due to the research restrictions of the pandemic, and therefore may not have captured the perspectives of families who don't receive services from a healthcare or other support service center, have proficiency in their country's dominant language, or those who are still awaiting or have not received a clinical ASD diagnosis. Future scholarship may include secondary caregivers' perspectives, as most of the studies highlighted in this review only included self-reports or behavioral ratings from others. Additionally, future work can take a critical disability studies lens that aims to move away from infantilizing individuals with autism and towards understanding the experiences of individuals with ASD from their own point of view. Finally, this review only examined the ongoing pandemic literature and the potential long-term mental health outcomes of parents 1, 5, or 10 years after the end of the COVID-19 pandemic has yet to be uncovered. In conclusion, the COVID-19 pandemic shed light on the gravity of parental distress and the potential mental health ramifications when parents are not adequately supported. I also observed that geographic location and cultural context play an important role, but the power of building or maintaining a national mental and behavioral health infrastructure where adaptive coping strategies are promoted should also be emphasized. Overall, this review elucidates the need for more targeted mental health support for families and continued advocacy for families with ASD. This project would not have been possible without the guidance and mentorship of my amazing faculty mentor, Dr. Catherine Stavropoulos, or the continued support and generosity of the UC Honors Program. Here are my references, and I just want to give a big thank you to everyone for coming out. Thank you so much.